Good morning. Please could the witness be sworn?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good morning. Please could you give your full name to the inquiry?
Yes, Daniel Byron York-Smith.
Thank you. Mr York-Smith, you have provided the corporate witness statement on behalf of His Majesty's Treasury. It's dated the 7th of April 2025. Can we turn to the internal page 55, please, where we see your signature and statement of truth? And can I ask you, in respect of this corporate statement, can I ask you to confirm are the contents of the statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Now, it's clear that there's a huge amount of work gone into the corporate statement. And perhaps if we start with identifying you and your role, it's right, isn't it, that you are Director General for Tax and Welfare at His Majesty's Treasury?
Yes.
And at the time of the pandemic and these events, you were Director of Strategy Planning and the Budget Group at Her Majesty's Treasury at that time. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And before then we get into the detail of the department, can you just give us some idea as to how long you've worked within the Treasury, please?
Yes, so I've been in the Treasury for just over 20 years. In a variety of roles. I spent a brief time out of the Treasury on secondment to the Prime Minister's office.
Thank you. Now, it's right, isn't it, that in addition to a large volume of material that sits alongside this statement, there are also a number of appendices that help to clarify what was happening and the Treasury's role and involvement.
Yes.
But beyond this, we've also received the relevant statement from the Chancellor dealing with his decision-making relative to some of the matters that I'm going to be asking you about today.
Yes.
And I think as a civil servant, you're particularly anxious that I clarify the remit of your assistance today and that you weren't the decision maker.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Can we then please just capture the position of the Treasury? Because I'm going to be asking you some questions to see if you can assist today a little more in respect of the statutory sick pay system, the England-only test and trace support payments, decisions on funding for the expansion of testing, inequalities and some recommendations. But if we perhaps identify the decision makers in the Treasury, please, if we please move to your paragraph 8 at page 3, please, of the statement. And again, I'm not going to spend time on this. Her ladyship is well aware of the structures and having heard evidence. It's right, isn't it, that the Chancellor and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury are responsible for public expenditure?
Yes.
And that the Treasury officials assist in decision-making by advising ministers?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And I think you detailed at paragraph 10 that the role of the Treasury is to set budgets, apply spending controls and influence strategic decisions. And I think when we come on to the testing, it's right, isn't it, that the Treasury in a later period did then exert some control on spending relating to testing?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. But having said that, I think it's right to acknowledge the huge volume of funding that was provided to support the testing. You deal with it within the statement more broadly, but it's right, isn't it, that the total budget for the 2020 to 2021 period for testing provided was 22 billion?
Yes, that's right. It increased at various points. The final budget was 22 billion.
Thank you. And that's just for the 2020,
yes.
2021. I'm not going to get into further detail. So when we look at the detail around the isolation aspect that we're going to look at, I think the wider context as to funds attributed to the test, trace, isolate system need to be understood. Thank you. Now, also, can we also confirm together that in the context of test and trace in England, financial support for those self-isolating in the form of statutory sick pay is a reserved matter in Greater Britain? And perhaps if we just look at your paragraph 10. Thank you. Because it's right, though, isn't it? In respect of health, that is a devolved matter. And policies around testing, tracing and isolating in the event of infectious disease are dealt with by the devolved administrations.
That is correct. I would say also that with respect to the reserved policy on statutory sick pay, the Northern Ireland Executive have generally tended to follow the approach of Great Britain. So although the Treasury didn't make policy, it was likely that that policy would be adopted in Northern Ireland too.
Thank you. And I don't think we'll need to get into the detail of this with you, but I think it may be relevant to some of the evidence we hear later. It's right, isn't it, because health is devolved, where the Treasury increased the spending allocation for health. Essentially, there's a Barnett consequential, there's a process that goes through to essentially give the equivalent extra allocation to the devolved nations to reflect the uplift in spending that's been allocated to health.
That is correct. I understand that this has been covered in previous modules to the inquiry, but there was a kind of wider approach to how to give the devolved government certainty about the amount that they would receive, given the fact that the increase in resources allocated to test and trace was, and indeed the wider health system was evolving very quickly.
Thank you. Can we then please deal with some details relating to the statutory sick pay? And that can be taken from the screen. Thank you. It's right, it's a general position. Statutory sick pay pre-March of 2020 was paid for by employers from the 4th day of illness with no entitlement to workers for the first 3 days.
That's correct.
It was paid at that time at a rate of £94.25 for 28 days.
Correct, yeah.
And it also, employees were only entitled to that payment if they earned over £118 a week.
I believe it was 120 was the lower earnings limit, but yes.
Thank you. And it obviously follows that statutory sick pay does not cover those who are self-employed.
Yes.
And so can we perhaps just look, for the first portion of my questions on statutory sick pay, at the changes, but also the process that led to those changes, please. Could we look together, please, at your paragraph 116, which is on page 31? And I think it's right that the change that happened in respect of statutory sick pay, on the 11th of March, the Chancellor announced that statutory sick pay would be available from day one and was extended to those who were self-isolating and to carers for individuals who were self-isolating because of COVID-19.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, can we next then move, please, to a document just to look at the progression relating to statutory sick pay, please, and its adequacy. Please, could we display I&Q 585998? Thank you. And can we move into page 3 of this document? Thank you. Now, Mr. York-Smith, on the 19th of March, the officials prepared a paper considering a number of options, including increasing the rate of statutory sick pay and removing the lower earning limit to statutory sick pay. And the increase to the statutory sick pay was not included in a package of welfare measures that were then announced the following day on the 20th of March. But we can see that there's consideration in respect of that within this document. But can I ask you, why then was the increase to the statutory sick pay not included in the measures then announced on the 20th of March? Are you able to give any clarity around that, please?
So that was a decision for the Chancellor on the basis of this advice. I could offer a bit of context to the wider package of announcements that were made on the 20th of March, where the Chancellor announced a number of measures which are intended to address the economic consequences of the restrictions that were being put on businesses and individuals. Some of those yet to be fully announced and were announced the following week. And so the Chancellor had asked for advice on the furlough scheme, what became the furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, but also recognised that one of the economic consequences might be an increase in unemployment, and therefore wanted measures in the welfare system to address that. So this was primarily targeted on the economic shock as opposed to isolation. What his office said in one of the other documents relating to this table was that his priorities were simplicity, operational delivery, and things which are clearly for the current situation rather than the longer term. So that was what I can say about what his office said about his decision making, but it was in the context of a package aimed at particularly reflecting the fact there might be an increase in unemployment as a result of some of the restrictions.
Thank you. Can I ask you just slightly to slow down when you're giving your answers, just to help the stenographer? Thank you. I think that can be removed from the screen. And perhaps if I give a context to the questions I'm asking about the statutory sick pay, and when we move on to the support to isolation payment, it's because the inquiry is seeking to explore what financial provisions there were to assist those to isolate, and then what impact that may have had on those decisions around isolation. So that's why we're looking at the context. Then I ask just some additional questions, please, on the statutory sick pay. Are you able to assist? What was the Treasury's role in decision-making regarding the adequacy of statutory sick pay for those required to self-isolate during the pandemic? Just to give a broader context, please, to that, appreciating the shock answer you just gave and the impact it could have on restrictions.
So statutory sick pay policy is the responsibility of the Department for Work and Pensions, but because of the cost to businesses, because statutory sick pay is paid by businesses, the Chancellor and the Treasury have an interest, and so it has been the case that statutory sick pay has generally been made in, changes to it have been made in budgets. Not necessarily. There has been a recent change to statutory sick pay, which was announced by the Department for Work and Pensions, which has made some changes to the policy, which we might come on to later. Obviously, the changes to eligibility, the waiting days, the requirement for a fit note, and so on, and it being made available for self-isolators was made in the budget in 2020. So we have an interest in terms of also the trade-offs between the cost to employers and the impact, the potential impact on employment of increasing the cost to employers of employment-related rights like statutory sick pay.
Thank you, and thank you for giving the broader context. Can I then ask, was any assessment made by the Treasury of whether statutory sick pay eligibility criteria such as the minimum earnings threshold, excluded vulnerable workers, and if so, how this was to be addressed?
So in the table that you previously showed, it was noted that removing the lower earnings limit would increase the number of people eligible for statutory sick pay by 2 million people. But the other consideration in the advice for the Chancellor was about the fact that a number of people's earnings, if their earnings were lower than the amount of statutory sick pay, you might create a perverse incentive for people to be sick rather than working. So we sought to contextualise the wider system and indeed the rates of welfare through the universal credit and so on.
Thank you. Now, appreciating that there's a portion of your statement already that deals with questions and issues of inequalities, but particularly around statutory sick pay, are you able to assist any further with the extent to which Treasury decision-making on statutory sick pay took into account the disproportionate financial hardship regarding self-isolation to minority ethnic communities?
So I'm not able to add to what is in my statement on this. I guess I would say my recollection at the time is that the question of self-isolation was not a question which was being raised with the Treasury by the Department for Health and Social Care, who are responsible for self-isolation policy as it is a health policy, because at that point testing was primarily in hospital settings. There wasn't community testing. we had on the 20th of March not actually required people to stay at home. So I think it was a feature of our advice later in the pandemic, particularly on thinking about restrictions, and I'm sure we'll come to it in some of the later documents. But at that point, this was through the lens of the economic shock rather than through self-isolation.
Thank you. Can we then please display your paragraph 118 at page 31, please? On the 8th of April 2020, officials sent advice to the Chancellor regarding an extension of the statutory sick pay to those shielding and told to stay home for 12 weeks, with an estimated 900,000 extremely vulnerable people having received a shield letter. And obviously you detail within this paragraph here, refer to a Department of Work and Pension estimate that 200 to 400,000 of those sent letters were employed in anecdotal evidence through MPs' correspondence suggested there were cases where employers were refusing to furlough someone being shielded or to pay them for that period. And the advice to the Chancellor recommended an extension to cover this cohort, which was agreed by the Chancellor. And if we then go to paragraph 119, please, over the page, you've also detailed that further advice was provided to the Chancellor, noting growing pressure to consider further support to those clinically extremely vulnerable who had been asked to shield. And can we look, please, at the email that went alongside this time of the 22nd of May, please? It's INQ 585929. Thank you. If you orientate yourself, I think it's one of the documents that's provided to you. Thank you. And then can we move within that email to page 2, please? Thank you. And essentially, if we can go back a page. Thank you. Essentially, it references that there's a lot of Whitehall pressure to announce something next week on this. And are you able to assist us as to what the pressure exactly was around the advice from officials on the 22nd of May 2020 in the context of statutory sick pay and support for isolation?
My understanding, my recollection is, and from the other documents, that this was less specifically about statutory sick pay. This was about financial support for those people who were shielding, and the advice itself notes that that's in the context of a potential change to the shielding programme, but also to the coronavirus job retention scheme, where it was intended that there would be employer contributions from later in the year, and therefore the willingness of employers to provide support to furlough people who were shielding might be reduced. So I think it was in that wider context rather than specifically being about statutory sick pay. There was a question about whether to extend the rebate that had been introduced for small businesses to help them meet the cost of statutory sick pay. But this advice was more about financial support for the clinically extremely vulnerable, given the changes to the shielding programme and to the furlough scheme.
Thank you. And again, with the reference to pressure, are you able to help us as to what the pressure that was being referenced there was?
I'm not able to add to that. I don't recall exactly what was being asked for.
Okay, thank you. Can we then take that down and use your witness statement again at paragraph 119 to help us navigate the rest of my questions on statutory sick pay, please? You tell us that on the 22nd of May, ahead of planned announcements on the future of CJRS, can we just confirm what CJRS is?
That is the coronavirus job retention scheme.
Thank you.
The
furlough,
yeah.
Thank you. And the shielding programme, officials provided advice to the Chancellor. The advice noted there was growing pressure to consider options for further support and sought initial policy steers regarding future financial support to the clinically extremely vulnerable. I think I've already asked you about the pressure. It's no different there to what we see in the email. Thank you. You tell us that the advice noted the upcoming changes in employer contributions to furlough and a pending review of the shielding programme would increase pressure to clarify the financial support available to the clinically extremely vulnerable. So this is now a second reference to increasing the pressure. And can you just give us some context as to who is providing the pressure that you're referencing there?
I probably have to assume that it was people affected by the change, by the increase in the, by the fact that, as the witness statement says, and in the submission which we disclosed, that the changes might mean some people who were able to be furloughed might no longer, their employer might no longer furlough them because the employer had to provide a contribution, whereas in the early part of the scheme they didn't, and the fact that a larger number of people potentially would be asked to shield. So there were the review, one potential outcome of the review was to increase from 2.2 million the population advised to shield to as many as 16 million, and therefore there might be additional people who are being advised to shield and would request financial support.
Thank you. Now, just continue with this paragraph. You tell us that the advice recommended that the Chancellor hold off making decisions on further support for shielders until more clarity was provided by the Department of Work and Pension, the MHCLG and the Department of Health and Social Care on the characteristics of the shielding cohort. And then it goes on, the advice also asked for a steer to work up further income support options for the shielded group. Ultimately, the Chancellor decided that statutory sick pay was sufficient at the time, but indicated he was content to consider this again once further clarity and evidence on the shielding programme was available. And so can I ask you, are you able to help us as to what was then being done more broadly to give the evidence to the Chancellor to inform what was needed for other financial support schemes, please?
That advice covered a range of things, and particularly I think the uncertainty was about the size of the shielding programme. So 2.2 million, the 2.2 million people we understood more about the characteristics of. The 16 million, if it were to be expanded that far, we didn't have the same information on the characteristics of. I think the advice notes that on average, someone who was furloughed was receiving £253 per week, and that compared to £95.85 for statutory sick pay, £94.59 for universal credit, £74.35 for the employment support allowance. So some of it was about the context of what support was available for those people now versus the support that was available, might be available if the programme was expanded. It recommended looking at particularly the economically active group within that. Not everyone who might be asked to shield or was shielding was in work, and the advice was to focus on that.
Thank you. Can we then please look at INQ 585068, please, which is the submission from the Treasury, which was titled Financial Support for the Shielded, dated the 22nd of May. And then perhaps if we can move within that document to paragraph 7, please, where some analysis is provided as to the Department of Health and Social Care suggesting that of the 2.2 million asked to shield, 29% normally work. Of this group, 38% are working from home, 43% say they cannot work from home, and 13% say they can work from home but have stopped or are furloughed. And I think the latter two groups are considered to be the most exposed to income shocks as they're unable to work, unlike pensioners or long-term sick supported. And we can see it says as a maximum we recommend targeting any further support at the economically active group. Now, again, in the context of the questions I've asked you about pressures as well, are you able to help us to whether you, the Treasury, or the advice to the Chancellor undertook any analysis of the number of people who are clinically vulnerable and shielding or will be required to stay at home due to having COVID-19 symptoms, and whether that may impact on them not following the guidance to isolate?
So I think because the isolation policy was generally was a health policy, it was the Department of Health and Social Care who were the most able to do that analysis, and that is what this excerpt that you've highlighted is intended to do, is to, of the 2.2 million, who are the people who can't work from home or have stopped working or are furloughed, and that was why the advice was that those were the people that the Chancellor should focus any further any financial support on.
Thank you. Now, the last questions on statutory sick pay before we move to the test, trace and support payments. Could I ask please for to display 585069, which is an email of the 29th of May 2020. Thank you.
So just before you go on, you said, Mr. Hawkesworth, that the isolation policy is health policy, and
Yep.
I understand that. Do you remember the DHSC presenting the Treasury with any papers to argue that it was important to ensure that people would isolate by being properly supported financially?
So I think when we come on to the test and trace support payments, that was where I recall that partly I think it reflected the changing nature of the restrictions, and at a point where many settings were closed, it wasn't something that there were lots and lots of discussions about. As we opened settings and began to develop a test and trace system where people could know whether they tested positive and isolate, it became a thing which was discussed, and I think particularly with respect to the test and trace support payments.
Thank you. Sorry, I went too early.
No, not at all. Thank you. So we're back with the email of the 29th of May, please. We can see it's reported that the Chancellor's view that there was no rush to work up a new solution. His starting point is that there should be no income replacement stream, that statutory sick pay is adequate, and there's reference again to a bit of pressure from some quarters to come up with a more generous answer on this question of financial support for shielders and isolators. The clear steer from the Chancellor is that he's happy for you to work up targeted income support options for shielders when there's further clarity on the shielding programme and on the basis of evidence in the usual way. And are you able to help us with any clarity as to why it was felt there was no rush at this stage, bearing in mind we are now the 29th of May and obviously the strategy in respect of test, trace and isolator was issued in May?
So I can't elaborate on the decision making and particularly the way it's expressed, other than it was a response to the advice which recommended that we do work up an income. I think the previous document we looked at recommended that we work up an income support scheme.
Thank you. And in respect to that income support scheme, was there any thought as to what that was going to look like and who was tasked with creating that income support?
As it was, the Chancellor said that there was no rush, and therefore we should, and that it was adequate. I think we'll come onto it with the test and trace support payment, that a lot of this, the Treasury's role was about scrutinising the proposals to spend taxpayers' money and providing that sort of scrutiny, rather than necessarily developing the support scheme, which was within the context of a programme for the shielders clinically extremely vulnerable, which was a combination of the Department for the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, and the Department for Health and Social Care.
Thank you. So let's move now on to any further assistance you can provide beyond that in the statement around decisions on the test, trace and support payments scheme. And perhaps to help us all and just to remind us all, can we display a helpful table from within the expert report that the inquiry has received from Professor Matchin? It's INQ 575999. Thank you. And the inquiry's already heard some evidence that the schemes as they operated across the four nations differed, but we can see there England's test and trace support payment that came in the October of 2020. And perhaps we just go over the page. So we've also captured Northern Ireland's discretionary scheme that was introduced in the March of 2020. Thank you. And then just whilst we're in the report of Professor Matchin, just to identify the principle I've already indicated why I'm asking you these questions. Can we look, please, within the report, if we could move forward to page 8. Thank you. And just paragraph 4, the reason why I'm asking in particular about this next scheme is Professor Matchins identified, this report finds that there's a clear evidence that the ability and willingness to self-isolate is linked to financial status. The United Kingdom government acknowledged the risk that people would not self-isolate because of their financial circumstances. And then, obviously, he goes on to make some recommendations. So if we could take that from the screen, please. Particularly with some of the emails we've already looked at, was it understood within the Treasury that if there wasn't adequate financial support, that people wouldn't isolate, and that had an ability to undermine the whole system of test, trace and isolate?
I think if I could put it in some wider context, there were a very large number of schemes introduced through the early part of 2020, which intended to support people with particularly the economic impacts of the pandemic through the furlough scheme, the self-employed support scheme. Those provided significant support for many people, including support if you were isolating. But as I know the inquiry will consider in a later module, there were people who were not eligible for those schemes by reasons of design and delivery and the trade-off between that and the potential for fraud and perverse incentives. The Treasury was very supportive of a functioning test and trace system and spent a lot of time producing analysis of the potential economic benefits of a functioning test and trace system. So we definitely recognise that it was very important to have a functioning test and trace system. As I expect we'll come on to with the documents, the Chancellor was particularly concerned about the perverse incentives that might be created and the ability to target those people who weren't being supported by the other schemes. So definitely recognise the importance of the system working. As always, because it's spending taxpayers' money, wanting to scrutinise what the evidence was and also to target those people who needed the support and avoid issues like giving money to people who had no loss of income, controlling for fraud, and the delivery of the schemes, which was particularly difficult.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to look at the SAGE advice of May, and then I'm not going to be able to look at the various correspondence advice that look at the evolution of the thought process around the need for there to be adequate financial support to isolate. But if I can use the SAGE advice as of the 1st of May, please. Can we display, please, INQ 61540? Thank you. And if we could move within that document to page 3, and it's just paragraph 20 I want to ask you about, please. So this is SAGE identifying a high level of adherence to request to isolate is required for the system to be effective. And the following paragraph, risks include individuals becoming less willing to comply if they're repeatedly asked to isolate and if they're impacted financially from being asked to isolate. And was it well known on this advice of SAGE understood in the department in May of 2020?
I'm afraid I don't recall whether this particular SAGE readout was widely known about in the Treasury.
Thank you.
But the principle?
The principle, yes.
Thank you. And I know as part of the documents you provided and the submissions, the documents for the preparation today, there's then a train of advice, documents, emails that again flag time and time again, would you agree, this principle. And so what I want to ask you about is, bearing in mind that was many months before that isolation support scheme came in, can you help us to understand were the tensions, what was happening, was it being ignored? What was the reason for the delay in introducing an isolation support package, please?
So I suppose I should go back to the isolation support scheme was part of a test and trace system, and therefore it was the responsibility of the Department of Health and Social Care. And when the Prime Minister requested options for this. They were requested from the Department of Health and Social Care, the Treasury, and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, reflecting the fact that DHSC were the lead department for this. The potential delivery mechanism involved local authorities, and so it was for MHCLG. And then the Treasury's role was, as is the case on this whole programme, to scrutinise the costs, the evidence, and provide advice to the Chancellor, and then for the Chancellor to decide. So as to the time taken for something to be announced, there were a number of factors that we had to reflect in our advice. And then there was a difference of view between ministers, and there was a discussion between ministers about what the policy should be, reflecting the fact that the Department of Health and Social Care would be the department responsible, but the Chancellor had to authorise the expenditure.
Thank you. And just on that point, can I ask you, because part of the documents that have been provided to you is the email of the 19th of June of 2020 that stated that the Prime Minister himself had raised concerns about the possibility that people might feel compelled to not comply with guidance to isolate due to financial pressures. And so factoring in the Minister's views, and in particular this is the Prime Minister himself on the 19th of June, can you assist why it was not done sooner when the Prime Minister himself, and I think also in the correspondence, Dido Harding, was raising the need for there to be this isolation support?
So that, if I could put in context some of the rest of that commission, it also said that the Prime Minister shared the Chancellor's position that everything else equal, we would not want to act where there's a risk of setting a precedent and creating liabilities for longer term increases to welfare support. And that commission itself went to the Department for Health and Social Care, the Treasury and MHCLG. So the role for designing the scheme was for the Department for Health and Social Care, obviously with Treasury input as regards our responsibility to scrutinise the cost and other features of the design in order to advise the Chancellor. So that was the beginning of a process which involved discussion between the three departments, which led to the announcement in late August of the regional pilots of what became the test and trace support payment.
Thank you. Now, I know you've had provided to you in the pack as well a submission from the Treasury from August of 2020, where it was suggesting an option of £330 based on the sorry, perhaps we just display that so I can contextualise the question, please. 585074, please. It's internal pay 5. Essentially, it's a document itself that was identifying the need for the national living wage. Thank you. So page 5, paragraph 16. And if we keep moving through the document, please. Thank you. I think if we move along, I think there may be... Move along again, please. Thank you. And so, are you able to assist at all in the thought processes why, when there was the figure, the option of 330 being identified, why that didn't feature sooner?
Sorry, it's displaying a different page, so I'm
sorry, can we go back, please, to paragraph 16? Thank you.
So, I think this illustrates the point that I made about the Chancellor's view that he was concerned about how this payment would fit in with a wider system of support, and particularly worried about perverse incentives where you might be paid more to isolate than you were paid in work, where there was something, at the time, there was something like 6.5 million people who earned less than 35 hours at the national living wage. And so, the rates of universal credit and so on. So it was within that context. I think this is pointing to a debate that was had at the time about whether this was income replacement or whether it was an incentive. So is it compensation or an incentive that we want to provide, where compensation would be much more complicated to deliver because you would need to understand what people's incomes were. An incentive would be more straightforward administratively.
Thank you. Can we then please display your paragraph 148, please, on page 38, which is now when we get to the 500 figure, which was the figure introduced under the TTSP. Thank you. So paragraph 148. As the requirement on self-isolation changed to require individuals to isolate for a shorter period of time, the flat rate of £500 TTSP became more generous in relative terms. I think it's the position you just set out, and I think you've done your analysis depending on what the isolation periods were, whether they were the 14 or reduced to the 7, what that meant for a daily figure. And could I ask you, looking at those figures and appreciating it when it depended on what the isolation requirement was, do you agree that for many workers receiving £35 or £50 per day would represent a significant reduction in their earnings during the period of self-isolation and is well below minimum wage if someone's working full-time?
That is factually true. I guess to the point that I made earlier, there were 6.5 million workers at the point that we're talking about who earned less than 35 hours at the national living wage. The scheme needs to account for working patterns and income levels. And as I say, by moving to a flat rate payment, it was very much more an incentive payment than it was earnings replacement. It was also designed only to be for those who had lost income as a result of self-isolation. 68% of employees receive more than statutory sick pay as part of their employer's sick pay offer. So the setting of the payment was a question about trading off the incentive effect, the deadweight cost of people receiving more than they would receive otherwise, the incentive cost, and the higher the payment, the greater the risk of fraud. And there was some evidence that there were fraudulent claims of the payment. But sorry.
Can I ask you, when Wales increased their isolation payment in August of 2021 to £750, and obviously that uplift was in place until the January of 2022. Can you assist as to what thought was given internally within the Treasury that the similar uplift should then, as a matter of equity or fairness, equally apply to the scheme operating in England?
I'm afraid I can't. I don't recall seeing any consideration about that. But by that point, it was the scheme, because of the restrictions and the testing and tracing regime and vaccination and so on. It was a much smaller part of the overall picture of test, trace, and isolate.
Thank you. I'm going to move then briefly onto the topic around testing, please, and funding for testing. Can I ask, how did the Treasury decisions on the scale and scope of funding for community testing initiatives ensure that high-risk groups, including ethnic minority communities, were prioritised?
Generally, on funding for testing, the Treasury took a very, very flexible approach, and I know that some of this has been covered in previous modules on vaccines, so I won't do this at length. But the Treasury approved almost all of very quickly the requests from the Department of Health and Social Care for the resources they required for testing, and that saw a very quick ramp up in expenditure on testing from sort of tens of millions in March 2020 to 10 billion by June 2020, and that envelope was then for the Department for Health and Social Care to allocate. So the Treasury would not have taken a view on the allocation of the testing other than continuing to challenge the Department of Health and Social Care about having a strategy for using the testing and to ensure that there wasn't unused capacity. And so I think the question of how to use the testing capacity and its impact on equalities would be a question for the Department for Health and Social Care.
Thank you. Can you then help us, please, with what you tell us in paragraph 51 of the statement, please? It's page 15, INQ 587305, please. And really, it's the view that the Treasury was expressing as to the effectiveness or efficiency of testing in the context of the substantial funding. You say this at paragraph 51.
Yep.
As England continued to reopen over the summer, there were some concerns around the effectiveness of the test and trace system. The Department of Health and Social Care advocated for an expansion of the test and trace system. However, Her Majesty's Treasury's officials wanted to first focus on addressing the performance issues within the programme and improving cross-Whitehall governance to ensure that the strategy was deliverable, better targeted, prioritised on the basis of evidence, and more fully utilising testing capacity that had already been procured. And then we can see on the next paragraph, you provide some further details on the SAGE advice about the needing to identify 80% of contacts. And then, so are you able to help us at all as to the concerns, how the concerns were crystallising in the Treasury, but also what lay behind the poor performance resourcing or operational issues from the Treasury's perspective, please?
First, I should recognise that the test and trace NHS Test and Trace was a very new organisation. Dido Harding had been appointed in early May. It had launched in late May, and it was the Treasury's objective here was to try and get the balance right between being supportive and challenging, recognising the enormous endeavour of going from very limited testing to very widespread testing. That said, we recognise the economic case for funding testing and driven by the SAGE advice about the potential impact on transmission of the virus if you had an effective test and trace system. But we had concerns about how deliverable it was, so whether there was sufficient capacity to do the tests, so whether we had unutilised lab capacity, whether the testing was being targeted at the highest risk settings, the highest risk groups, to your earlier question about equalities impacts, but also to the highest risk areas of the country, and that we didn't have capacity that was going unutilised, and there was evidence that utilisation was low in some areas. There was also, I think, because the expansion was extremely quick, there wasn't necessarily a strategy for how best to use the testing, and there wasn't sufficient financial control. As evidenced later in the year, we approved a budget of 22 billion, but in the end, towards the very end of the financial year, 2021, the underspends grew from sort of 300 million to 5 billion, 7 billion, and in the end it underspent by 9.5 billion, and there are obviously opportunity costs to that in terms of the ability to raise the finance, whether that money could have been used elsewhere. So we wanted to support, but equally we wanted to challenge to make sure this very significant investment of public money was delivering all of the objectives that it could, both economically and for the health outcomes.
Thank you. And I think that answer may have preempted this question, but perhaps if there's anything else you want to say. Obviously, we know that it was the Department of Health and Social Care's responsibility for the test and trace system. And really, so why was the Treasury challenging the Department of Health and Social Care's proposal to expand test and trace?
I think, there's not much I can add to what I said, which is before expanding, we wanted to see that it was delivering its objectives. And as it was, we did agree to expand, and I think it was not until October where we recommended that there might be a pause. The other point I would add is that the technology for testing was changing. Whether the tests were effective was a question that was asked at the beginning of the pandemic. Through the pandemic, different testing technologies became available, and the Treasury was very permissive and flexible in the way that it approved spending, recognising this very rapid development, but But like I say, we wanted also to challenge to make sure it was being used effectively.
Thank you. Could we then please take that down and move to paragraph 61, please, of the statement at page 18? Now, we can see that you've identified that in a meeting on the 12th of August 2020 to discuss population-wide testing, the Prime Minister emphasised that obstacles raised by Baroness Harding involving the Cabinet Office and the Treasury approvals should be removed. The inquiry has already heard in Module 5 Lord Agnew speaking about spending approval on testing and short timeframes for approval. And can we just look at a relevant email, please, which is INQ 471020, which is an email exchange before this meeting of the 23rd of July. Thank you. And if we move to page 3, please. Thank you. We can see essentially Lord Agnew was concerned about the position essentially of being asked to approve £1.25 billion programme in one day. And obviously we can see Gareth Rhys-Williams commenting that whilst I get the political imperative is to set this up and fast, there are aspects I'm really not happy about. Can I ask, is this an example of a barrier related to Cabinet Office commercial controls that you were referencing in the paragraph 61 we looked at together? Or is that a different issue that's being raised in this email?
I think the Lord Agnew comment is particularly about the size of the approval and the amount of time given to consider it. The Cabinet Office commercial controls are more about the approval of individual contracts. I think this is an example of the spending approval process and whether sufficient information and time has been given. Generally, through the pandemic, the Treasury was extremely flexible and extremely quick to approve, but there is a balance that needs to be struck.
Thank you. And can we then, just to complete this portion of questioning, look at Lord Agnew's letter of the 10th of December, please, which is INQ 585972. And whilst that's being displayed, the letter itself, you tell us about this. Sorry, should I give the INQ again? 585972. Sorry, I think I've given you a rogue reference. It's 477870. And with apologies to Lawrence. 477870. Thank you. Thank you. And we can see this is a letter that you've been provided with from Lord Agnew to Baroness Harding. Now, you tell us in your witness statement, just whilst you're looking at this, that of this letter, with Baroness Harding outlining Lord Agnew's significant concerns about Test and Trace's governance and how it was using public money, Lord Agnew had believed the previously agreed 150 million spending controls should be reviewed and that they should consider freezing approval on long-term contracts until a forecast and an outline of the governance structure was further developed. And so we can see Lord Agnew's concerns here. And are you able to help us then? Why were ministers being asked to approve such significant sums of spending at such short notice? And why were these spending decisions not subject to greater scrutiny?
The question about notice, I think, is difficult for me to answer. That was the Department for Health and Social Care and NHS Test and Trace making these requests. I think I can only say what I said before in terms of the Treasury's approach. We had, I should say, in October 2020, given ministers' advice suggesting that we should pause on our approval of the increase in testing because there was a risk that there was wasted capacity and the use of the tests was not delivering the best possible outcomes in terms of economic outcomes. But ministers chose that they didn't agree with that advice and said that instead we should work on the impact. So I think this was a kind of consistent a consistent concern, but one that had to be balanced against what were very difficult circumstances, and particularly I think there was a lot of competition for the acquisition of the tests. And we were also, in terms of mass testing, which this sort of level of testing enabled, there was very strong evidence of the potential benefits from a health perspective, but therefore an economic perspective of being able to identify as many cases in the community as possible.
Thank you. Now, I'd headlined when we started together that one of the topics will be inequalities. I think as we've dealt with the evidence, I've weaved those in and I've asked the relevant questions I wanted to around inequalities. And again, you've addressed it within the statement, but is there anything further you'd wish to say in respect of inequalities?
So I think a couple of things that are in the documents that we've disclosed with respect to this module. The first point I should make is the one that I've already made, which is generally where the Treasury is engaged in spending control and the approval of spending proposals, it's for the department responsible for a programme to produce the equalities analysis. We did provide the Chancellor, as he notes, as Mr Sunak notes in his statement, with periodic updates on the equalities impact of the pandemic in general, and there was some advice that we gave him, which is part of the disclosures for this module, about the strategy for the winter, which noted the differential impacts by different protected characteristics of the economic impacts of the pandemic, but also the restrictions. We also, where, for example, we approved the pilot of the test and trace support system, test and trace support payments in the Northwest, noted the equalities analysis produced by the Department for Health and Social Care. So we did keep it in mind, and indeed it was one of the driving factors between the Treasury's view on, for example, the reopening of different sectors was the equalities characteristics of the people particularly affected in, say, retail or hospitality.
Thank you. Mr York-Smith, we thank the Treasury for the 6 pages of lessons learning that's within the statement. The statement will be published that details and sets those out. I'm afraid my time with you is now up, and so I'm going to turn to the call participants for them to ask their questions, please. Thank you.
Mr Jacobs. Mr Jacobs is right down the end.
I have a few questions on behalf of the Union Congress. Starting, if I may, with the issue of loss of income as a disincentive to self-isolation, and starting really with the basic point. In January 2021, a food manufacturing worker described to the GMB union that at their factory, most of the workers here work for £9.36 per hour, living from week to week, just managing to pay their bills without much extra. Do you think that in the pandemic, the Treasury recognised that for workers in that position, 2 weeks of lost pay would be a powerful disincentive to self-isolate?
So I think, as I've said in response to some of the earlier questions, the Treasury did provide advice on the economic impacts of the pandemic, and did provide advice about the characteristics of people who might benefit from the test and trace support payment. But the decisions about the appropriate level of the payment is one for ministers, which I can't.
My question wasn't so much whether advice was provided. I'm aware that advice was provided, but was the prevailing view in the Treasury, did it acknowledge that 2 weeks of lost pay for people on low income would be a disincentive to self-isolation?
I think as a civil servant, my job is to advise rather than have a prevailing view. So I'm afraid I can't add to what I've said.
I'll try putting it in a slightly different way. As you're providing advice, as your colleagues are providing advice to the Chancellor, is there a sense that the reluctance to provide financial support, the reluctance apparently to acknowledge that financial support or lack of will be a disincentive to self-isolation, just flies in the face of the reality for people working, for example, in a food processing factory?
I don't think I can add to what I've already said, which of course we advised on the impact, but it's for ministers to decide.
I'll try once more. I'm going to suggest actually that you can provide an answer, because Treasury officials are entitled to have a sense of whether the options taken fly in the face of the reality for people on the ground, of the reality of the advice given.
I'm afraid I have to disagree. Our role is to advise, ministers decide.
Giving it your best shot, Mr. Jacobs.
I have, so I'll move on to the next issue, which is the accessibility of the test and trace support payment scheme. A COVID-O paper in December 2020 described that the application process was too complex. So an individual had to find the relevant authority, find the criteria applied by that authority, find the forms, find what that particular authority required by way of evidence, and provide it. Was that recognised by the Treasury to be a problem with a local authority delivered scheme for support for self-isolation?
The Treasury was concerned about the delivery of the scheme throughout its development and its implementation. I do think, and this was set out in our advice to the Chancellor, that a local authority-led scheme was the best option to deliver, because local authorities, for example, had existing legal powers to make payments to individuals. They had access to the same data as the Department for Work and Pensions about people's benefit entitlement and about their incomes through real-time information. But clearly, the fact that it was the administration was complicated affected the take-up, and the take-up was lower than we would hope.
And does it really come to the point that it was too complex to achieve its objective, which was to incentivise or support self-isolation?
I can't say whether it was too complex, because it would depend what the alternatives were. As we saw with the direct economic support schemes, it was necessary for the self-employed income support scheme for people to make a claim, because it is not possible for the government to make a payment to someone without having their information. So the people who are in the benefit system, DWP, can make payments. There were reasons that it wasn't possible for DWP to make these payments, but for people who are not in the benefit system, the government requires some information from people in the first place in order to make a payment to them. So, HMRC there was an application process for that. So I think it was an inevitability that there was an application process involved in this, simply because the government doesn't hold the information in order to make direct payments to individuals.
On the observation that sort of assessing relative complexity depends on the alternatives, do you think that the alternative of statutory sick pay and expanding it, if necessary temporarily, would avoid some of that complexity of a novel and locally administered scheme?
So it would be a decision for ministers, so I don't want to speculate too much, but I think the types of advice, the types of factors that I would want to have in advice to them is that statutory sick pay is paid by employers, therefore can only benefit those people who are in employment, which doesn't capture the entire group that this policy was concerned with. It was also therefore a cost to employers, and it has to be seen within the system of whether the level of statutory sick pay would be higher than the level of income that someone would get from employment, recognising the variety of employments people have.
So clearly, as with all these issues, more than one consideration, and clearly statutory sick pay can't be the complete answer. But would utilising that existing scheme address the accessibility problem and the complexity problem? Because it's a scheme that everyone knows, it's via employers, etc.
Well, not for those who aren't in work, I think was the point Mr. Dr. Smith was making.
No, of course.
It's a different scheme, and ministers would have, it would be for ministers to decide whether they wanted to change statutory sick pay, and there are a set of people that wouldn't benefit, that did benefit from the test and trace support payments.
Yeah. Final point, which is perhaps linked with the complexity issue, is TUC research found very low levels of awareness of the scheme on a survey, finding only 1 in 5 workers were even aware it existed. Is your impression from your perspective in the Treasury that too was a feature of it being a locally administered scheme?
I don't think I can take a view on that because I don't know. But I don't think I can take a view on that. I guess the responsibility for publicising it would be for the department that was responsible for it. There were a large number of locally administered schemes for businesses and individuals, and there continue to be locally administered welfare support schemes. I think it's incumbent on everyone to promote these schemes, and I think it might be something that your organisation might promote in future to your members.
You certainly did reference it once or twice, but I think I've used my time, my lady. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Jacobs. Mr Thomas. Mr Thomas is over there.
Good morning, Mr York-Smith. My name's Leslie Thomas and I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Just before I get into my questions, just to be clear, so in the Treasury, you were providing advice, you were not making decisions, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So with that in mind, let me ask you this, and I'm interested in the advice you were given. Was the level of statutory sick pay considered sufficient to enable low-income and ethnic minority workers who were statistically more likely to be in precarious employment to comply with the self-isolation requirements? What was the advice?
The advice was not. The decision about whether something was sufficient was for ministers.
That wasn't what I asked you.
Our advice.
Finish, Mr Thomas, please.
Our advice noted the evidence on statutory sick pay, including how it compared to the system in other countries, and that is what our advice. And therefore, ministers could take a judgment.
Sorry, what was the advice? You went round in a circle.
No, I said that our advice about whether ministers wanted to make a change to statutory sick pay included a reference to the level of statutory sick pay compared to other countries.
Sorry, it may just be me being slow, but what was the advice in relation to whether ethnic minority workers would be able to comply given the self-isolation rules? What was the advice?
I can't really add to what I've said about what the advice was, which was the advice when we were asked about making changes to statutory sick pay in March 2020, noted the cost to employers of that, the impact on individuals gaining eligibility to it. When it came to advice about self-isolation, we didn't provide advice about self-isolation until it was in response to a request from the Department for Health and the Prime Minister and the Department for Health and Social Care in the summer of 2020.
Let me move on. Financial support and inequality, that's the next theme. And again, I'm just concentrating on the advice, not decisions, that you gave and the Treasury gave. So the question is this: what role did community leaders or representative groups of ethnic minorities play in the consultation process for financial support schemes like the Test and Trace Support Payment Scheme? So what role did they play?
The Treasury did not consult on the Test and Trace support payment because it was not a Treasury policy, so I'm afraid I can't answer what consultation was done by the Department for Health and Social Care.
All right. Moving on. I want to look at data. Did the Treasury gather disaggregated data to assess how ethnic minority and low-income communities were impacted by the test, trace and isolate measures? And if so, how was this data used to adjust policy in real time during the pandemic?
As I have said in answer to one of the previous questions, the Treasury provided advice to the Chancellor in the summer of 2020, which noted the impact on particular groups of the pandemic measures in a general sense. And they influenced, for example, the Treasury's involvement in the reopening of sectors where employment was particularly heavily from certain groups, including people from an ethnic minority background. In terms of adjusting the policies, like I say, the policy of test, trace and isolate was one for the Department for Health and Social Care. The Treasury's role was about approving the funding for that programme.
I want to be forward-looking and look at lessons that could be learned and recommendations. How can future funding frameworks better support low-income and precarious workers who are disproportionately from ethnic minority backgrounds to safely comply with public health requirements like self-isolation? So what would be the advice, having learnt lessons from the last pandemic? Help us.
I think it would depend on it would very much depend on the circumstances, what the health restrictions were, what the wider economic support was. And I think we have definitely learnt some lessons about being able to flush out different views between different departments more quickly. The trade-offs with other economic support and the interaction of, for example, income support through employers from the furlough scheme or an equivalent, with specific support for those people who were unable to access that support. So I think there are a number of lessons to be learned.
Finally, would you recommend automatic eligibility mechanisms or enhanced payment schemes, entitlements to remove financial disincentives to isolate? Would that be part of the advice?
I think, as I just said, it would depend on the circumstances. So we would have to tailor the advice that we gave and the schemes to the circumstances of a future pandemic. And then, of course, it would be for ministers to decide precisely what combination of things they wanted to go for.
Thank you, Mr. York-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Ms. Munro, who's just there.
Good morning, Mr. York-Smith. My name is Alison Munro and I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. I've just got two questions, Mr. York-Smith, but given your answers to Mr. Jacobs' first questions, I anticipate what your answers may be, but we'll see how we get on. Effectively, in February of 2020, the Treasury officials are advising on a budget packet, aren't you, to tackle COVID for the March 2020 COVID budget. You've been taken through statutory sick pay, and that's what I want to concentrate on. In particular, there were some minor changes to statutory sick pay in the COVID budget, but this did not include expanding SSP to self-employed, nor did it include an increase in the amount of statutory sick pay. Now, my first question is this: why were those measures not introduced to provide financial support and other assistance to enable those, such as the self-employed, who were required to shield or isolate, to stay at home? And I bear in mind what you say, that the Treasury advises, ministers decide, but it was part of the consideration of your advice was about SSP and extending it to the self-employed.
If I could put it in context, though, when the measures were developed for the 11th of March, there was not at that point any requirement for anyone to isolate. And when advising the Chancellor's objectives there were to try and the understanding of the virus and its impact was very, very different at the end of February to even by the middle of March. So when advising the Chancellor on that, his objectives were to try and deal with what he perceived at that point to be some of the impacts of COVID, where I think the belief at the time was that, and the reason that there was a change to statutory sick pay was that we were unaware of the seriousness of the virus, and therefore that there would be lots of people who would have a 2-week period where they had to stay at home because they were a little bit sick. So that was the context in which that decision was made. The requirement to isolate and the closure of sectors didn't come until after that point.
But the Treasury officials did flag up, didn't they, that an increase in SSP was one of the measures that potentially was viable, but it had the risk to business. When was that flagged up then?
That was after the budget.
Right.
So that was so the budget was on the 11th of March. The documents that we looked at earlier were from the 19th of March, and they were in the context of a package of measures which is intended to address the economic consequences of closing sectors and asking people to stay at home. So that was specifically about providing businesses with money to pay their staff's wages so that they didn't have to lay them off, but also recognising that some people would become unemployed and therefore increasing the generosity of the welfare system.
Thank you. Then my second question is then by August of 2020, and bearing in mind you were taken this morning to the SAGE advice, which you said wasn't particularly widely known in the Treasury Department, but in answer to my lady, you said the principle was. Did the Treasury recognise by August 2020 that unless people were supported to enable them to isolate, policies and isolation simply weren't going to work or not going to be as effective as they could be?
In August 2020, we were providing advice on what became the test and trace support payment, so yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Munro. I think I'm going to be consoled by the fact, Mr York-Smith, your knowledge of figures is extraordinary, your ability to recall them. Thank you very much indeed for the help that you and your colleagues in the Treasury have given to the inquiry in providing the witness statement and all the information contained therein, and for your help giving evidence today. Thank you. I shall return at 25 to 12.
Thank you.
All rise.
Ms Cartwright.
Thank you. Could I ask, please, for Ms Daniels to stand, please, and take the oath? Thank you.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the
the
truth,
whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Could you please give the inquiry your full name?
Joanne Therese Daniels,
And can I check, is it Miss or Mrs?
Miss.
Miss. Miss Daniels, can we first of all identify the corporate witness statement that you have provided? If we can go to page 169, please. We see your signature and the statement dated the 3rd of April of this year. And can I ask you, are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are, yes.
And perhaps if we identify the corporate organisation in respect of which this statement is provided, is it right it's provided to give the context from the Health and Social Services Group?
It is, yes.
Thank you. Can we then, first of all, start with identifying you and why you are the individual speaking to this corporate statement? It's right, isn't it, that in April of 2020, you were appointed as the Director of Test, Trace, Protect.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I think there's one correction in your statement, which is the end date of that role. And perhaps if we just display paragraph 7, which is at page 3, I think you identify in the statement that you held the role from April 2020 until the 30th of April 2024. I think that's in fact incorrect. I think is the end date of you being in that role 31st of March 2022.
That's correct, yes.
So save for that correction, everything else is correct. Is that?
It is.
Thank you. And let's then look at your background then, please, just to understand that role you were in. I think you tell us that between January 2020 and June of 2022, you held the position also as being the Director of Mental Health, Vulnerable Groups and NHS Governance.
I did, yes.
Thank you. And I think if we take things to the current day, you currently work with Cardiff Council as part of a collaborative agreement with the Welsh Government and have been since the 30th of April 2024. Therefore.
Yes, that's right.
And before that date, you were the Interim Director General for Education, Social Justice and the Welsh Language.
I was, yes.
And you'd held that position from the 1st of April 2022.
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
correct.
Now, again, we've already heard some evidence about the group, but can we just make sure that there's a good understanding about the group and how it fits together with the decision-making in the Welsh Government? It's right, isn't it, that the Health and Social Services Group provides strategic leadership and oversight of the NHS in Wales,
It does, yes.
and it's the conduit between the NHS in Wales and the Minister and Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And it's right, isn't it, that the Welsh Government is responsible for social care policy in Wales, and the group leads on engagement with the local authority, social services directors and the relevant ministers.
It does, yes.
And as we've already identified, during the pandemic, the structure of the pandemic expanded to create the Test, Trace, Protect Directorate.
It did, yeah.
And you were in that significant role as the Director of Test, Trace and Protect.
Yes, I was.
Thank you. Now, plainly, a huge amount of work has gone into the statement that deals with the involvement throughout the pandemic. And with the time I have with you, it's not going to be able to establish all of the chronology, but the statement will be published. But with your assistance, there's certain topics or themes that I'd just like your assistance to perhaps see if you can expand any further to that which you say within the witness statement. And the first topic on which I'd like your assistance, because it's going to become relevant as to what you know is a live issue, in particular for the COVID Brief Families for Justice Cymru, on the issue of asymptomatic transmission and testing. And so can we together identify the sources of advice for the group and then that informs government, please? Because you touch upon it in your witness statement. We perhaps start, first of all, with identifying who was the decision makers. We turn to paragraph 24, please, of your witness statement. Thank you. If we then move down, please, you identify that essentially Cabinet was the main decision-making body within the Welsh Government throughout the pandemic, and that Test, Trace and Protect would be discussed at Cabinet, and that matters in relation to testing and contact tracing sat largely under the remit and responsibility of the Minister for Health and Social Services, who we'll hear from this afternoon, who made decisions in relation to Welsh Government's Test, Trace, Protect policy.
That's correct, yes.
And so can you then assist when you were in the role within the Test, Trace, Protect group? How did that work practically during that time from you being enrolled, please, to inform decision-making?
So advice was presented to ministers in the form of ministerial advice papers which set out the matter for decision, the evidence and arguments relating to that decision, and then the recommendation of officials. Alongside those formal ministerial advice submissions, we also had regular meetings with ministers throughout the pandemic period.
Thank you. Can we then look at some of the paragraphs just on the issue of the flow of scientific advice, please? And can we move to your paragraph 100, please, which is internal page 30? Thank you. You detail that advice to support the development of Test, Trace, Protect was primarily provided by Public Health Wales, the Welsh Government's Technical Advisory Cell and Technical Advisory Group, and UK-wide structures that we were part of, for example, the Testing Initiatives Evaluation Board. And you say that Test, Trace, Protect also developed specific forums for discussion and debate on clinical and scientific evidence. And so can I be clear, please, about those forums for discussion and debate, please, in respect of scientific evidence? And if it helps, I think it's going to be most significant linked to the issue of asymptomatic transmission and testing, please.
So the two groups that I'm referring to here were the virology and testing subgroup of the Technical Advisory Cell, which was established, I think, in June or July 2020. And then subsequently, I think it was in November or December 2020, we set up the Testing and Clinical Advisory Board.
Thank you. And perhaps to see that in context, if we move to paragraph 103 on the next page. Thank you. You identify that, as you've just said, the Virology and Testing Technical Advisory Cell, the Testing Clinical Advisory Prioritisation Group, which I think you've just mentioned, but also the International Intelligence Technical Advisory Cell. And can I ask you, in respect of that International Intelligence Technical Advisory Cell, can you just give us a little bit more detail about that and how it worked in practice, please?
So this group wasn't specifically dedicated to testing or tracing. It was a broader group that was looking at international evidence in relation to COVID and then feeding that into the discussions and the debates within the Technical Advisory Group and Technical Advisory Cell.
Okay, thank you. Can we please then just look at what's said about other sources, 114 please, which is on page 34. You detail in paragraph 114, the Four Nations approach to the national testing programme also meant that the Health and Social Services Group had access to evidence, research, evaluations and perspectives from the wider academic, scientific and clinical community. This enhanced the range of sources of advice to support policy and decision-making alongside the Structures for Wales. Evaluation studies and assessments of new testing technology were a significant component of the UK testing programme. Now, can I ask you then, in respect of then academic literature and the like, how did that operate? And again, in the context of asymptomatic transmission, we know that the decision-making in respect of Wales and testing for asymptomatic transmission, I think, came in the May of 2020. But we've already heard some evidence about the knowledge and what was in academic literature about that developing need to test workers in particular, healthcare workers, for asymptomatic transmission. And I think you'll be aware that one of the concerns is the delay with introducing that testing. Are you able to help us as to how the wider academic literature was being considered by the group and the government on the issue of asymptomatic testing and transmission?
So the groups that I'm referring to in this paragraph were predominantly concerned with new testing technologies and were groups that we were part of in the latter part of 2020 and into 2021. In terms of the advice on asymptomatic testing in the early stage of the pandemic, so as you say, in the sort of March, April, May period, that advice would have come almost exclusively from Public Health Wales, from the Technical Advisory Cell, and of course from SAGE.
Thank you. Thank you. That can be removed, please. And can we then move to another topic that you identify linked to perhaps something that may have been informed by advice? Can we turn to your paragraph 118, please, which is at page 35? You've given a clarification on earlier evidence that the inquiry has heard on the issue of herd immunity, and you say this at paragraph 118. As far as I'm aware, no steps were taken by the Health and Social Services Group in the early phase of the pandemic to consider or implement a strategy consistent with furthering herd immunity. You then reference Mr. Drakeford's module statement, which says that discussion of herd immunity could be found in newspapers and in specific scientific community consideration. It was never a practical proposition in Wales and never proposed as such to the Welsh Cabinet. And you say this: I'm not aware of any discussion or conversation during the subsequent and remaining period of the pandemic relating to herd immunity involving yourself or anyone else from the Test, Trace, Protect team?
That's correct, yeah.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to come on, please, to ask you if you can assist us any further than what you say in your witness statement about the decision on the 12th of March to stop testing and contact tracing in Wales, which I think you know is, again, another issue of concern to the COVID bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. If we turn to your paragraph 124, please, which is where you start telling us at page 36, please, paragraph 124. We can see the decision of the, thank you, UK government on the 13th of March 2020 to end community testing, a reference to the SAGE advice, and essentially if we follow through that also is the position adopted by the Welsh government. And so appreciating that you were not in the role until the April of 2020, are you able to assist us any more in as to around the decision making that led to a particular decision in Wales to stop testing?
No, I'm afraid I can't add any more than is set out in the statement.
Okay. But then can we then together identify what testing availability and the laboratory system existed in Wales? You deal with the different laboratories that existed, and I just want to make sure we've got absolute clarity as to infrastructure, but also availability for testing. Particularly then as we move to when Wales also had the assistance through the National Testing Programme of the Lighthouse Laboratories. Now, you tell us in the witness statement, and if we go to paragraph 65, please. That's at page 19, please. You say at the beginning of the pandemic, the NHS in Wales had a network of NHS laboratories. The majority of these were managed by Public Health Wales to deliver pathology testing across the NHS. And just so we're absolutely clear about capacity and what existed, can you give us a bit more detail, please?
Early in the pandemic, Public Health Wales had developed a PCR test for COVID-19 and had begun to expand the capacity within their laboratory network. They expanded testing from being able to test something in the region of 800 samples a day through to, by September 2020, they had capacity for up to 15,000 samples a day.
Can I just pause you there, because I want to try and capture essentially numbers of laboratories that existed. I think you referenced that there were 13 laboratories, is that right, in Public Health Wales?
So they had a primary laboratory in Cardiff, and then they had a number of smaller laboratories across the NHS estate.
Thank you. And well, perhaps paragraph 117, you reference the local diagnostic services through 13 laboratories. That's page 35. And I just want to make sure that we've got complete understanding of existing capacity in Wales, particularly when there's later analysis of the decision to stop the testing in March of 2020. So 13 laboratories, and are they public health laboratories separate to the laboratories that existed in the hospitals?
They were Public Health Wales managed laboratories.
Thank you. And are you able to give us some idea as to the capacity within the laboratories themselves to do PCR testing before the decision to stop testing in March of 2020?
I don't have that figure, I'm afraid, no, at that point.
Thank you.
Sorry, I appreciate you weren't part of the decision, sir, but I'm just in case anybody misunderstands where the evidence is going. You talked about Public Health Wales expanding the testing from 800 to 15,000 by September. But isn't the plain fact that in March 2020, the reason community testing was ended because there weren't enough tests to do it around the community and they had to be focused on certain groups? Isn't that your understanding?
My understanding from the statements issued at the time was that the focus for testing was intended to be clinical use and diagnostics of particularly patients in hospital with COVID symptoms.
At the end of that sentence is because there weren't enough tests to carry them out on the community.
I wasn't aware of the testing volumes at that time, so I can't speak personally to that.
Well, we can put it to other witnesses.
Thank you. And can I perhaps just see if you can help us any further about that, just to understand the position on the ground as detailed in your statement. At paragraph 128, please, on page 38, you say that on the 16th of March 2020, the Public Health Wales confirmed 34 new cases had tested positive for COVID-19, which brought the total number of confirmed cases to 94. And that's why I just want to understand, I suspect you're not going to be able to help any further with the answers you've already given to her ladyship, but in terms of a decision that was taken, was it taken through the perspective of what could have been possible and continued in Wales in March of 2020 by way of the available testing capacity in laboratories that existed in Wales?
I'm afraid I don't think there's anything more I can add to what's in the statement.
Thank you. And then the same topic of the decision to stop testing and contact tracing. It's clear from everything in your witness statement and that is known that the approach to contact tracing in Wales throughout the pandemic and pandemic response retained its local feature, so using the local teams to do contact tracing. And can you just perhaps give your overview about contact tracing and how it operated in Wales?
Do you mean throughout the pandemic period or at the initial
Initially, what was
phase?
available in March of 2020, please?
So in March 2020, contact tracing was being undertaken by Public Health Wales. So it was being undertaken by the one organisation on behalf of the whole of Wales. I think it was recognised by Public Health Wales that in order to be able to operate at the scale envisaged as part of Test, Trace, Protect, that would not be feasible, and they advocated for a locally based contact tracing operation, which involved local authorities as the primary frontline deliverer of contact tracing services, working with health boards and other partners.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the system or the structure of contact tracing in Wales in March, is it fair to say that it was well established for that local community testing, albeit not of a scale of a pandemic?
So Public Health Wales had operated contact tracing in a number of contexts in terms of public health disease outbreaks. For example, I think in the statement it refers to cases of tuberculosis, other infectious diseases that they'd used contact tracing approaches to contain.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question, please, just to complete the section on the decision to stop testing and tracing in March 2020, just by reference to paragraph 609 of your witness statement, please, which is page 162, if that could be displayed. Thank you. You tell us in paragraph 609 about a response plan produced by Public Health Wales that set out the international evidence at the time of writing that report, and it also articulated various networks and fora that Public Health Wales was involved in, through which international evidence and experience of responding to the pandemic, including test and trace systems, could be shared. The question is, are you able to assist at all with what advice was also received in January to March of 2020, informed by international experiences and best practices, including early widespread testing and contact tracing of asymptomatic individuals and asymptomatic contacts?
No, I'm afraid that period is one I can't speak to.
Thank you. And so in terms of identifying the best person to help us with that in the witness that are to follow, would that be Mr. Gething?
Yes, or I believe that you're also hearing from Robin Howe from Public Health Wales, and he may be able to assist.
Thank you very much indeed. That can be taken down. Now, if you can then please assist me with the next topic, please. That is, please, in respect of, if you could help us just to understand, when you're using then the available testing infrastructure in Wales, as to how it evolved then to utilising the national testing programme and the Lighthouse Laboratories. And I'm going to just identify the Lighthouse Laboratory that came online in Wales, please. If we could just display the Lighthouse Laboratory, I'm afraid it's 587450. Sorry, my eyesight is struggling with that. It's the map of the Lighthouse Labs. It's being shown. Thank you so much. Now we can see, and we're going to come on to deal with the Newport that was opened in October of 2020. Can you then help us with identifying that date? Was Wales, once it was utilising the national testing programme, sending its samples then into the national testing Lighthouse Labs that existed outside Wales?
That's correct. So, to a significant extent, Wales started to use the testing capacity within the Lighthouse Laboratory network in May of 2020. At that point, samples were being sent to a number of laboratories across the UK under the operational direction of UK Test and Trace.
Thank you. And then in terms of that happening, and obviously you've also got the system of using the local testing labs, did that create any difficulty in terms of the data and the results that was captured? Was there a different system relating to the barcodes of the test results?
So the digital systems that existed to identify the sample and track the sample through the laboratory networks were different between the Lighthouse Lab and Public Health Wales, but the flow of the test results both to the patient and into the patient's medical records, that flow was in effect the same.
It was the same. So was there any issue in terms of the systems of the testing through the different routes in Wales?
So the routes were separate in the sense that you had sampling centres linked to a specific laboratory route, so the Lighthouse Laboratory route, and then you had separate sampling centres linked to the Public Health Wales laboratory network, and you could not switch between the two different routes.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the development and the availability of a laboratory specifically in Wales, you've told us in the witness statement essentially about how the thought was that was going to come online, I think, sooner than October 2020, and of the delays in establishing it. Did that have any impact then in terms of availability of testing in Wales, that you didn't have your own bespoke Lighthouse laboratory?
So the benefit of being part of the Lighthouse Laboratory network was that we had a share of the tests across the network as a whole. So we were not exclusively confined to the capacity that was available through the Newport lab. So, for example, tests taken from sampling sites in North Wales quite often went to Alderley Park because that was the nearest laboratory location. So while the delay in the Newport laboratory being established would have affected the capacity of the Lighthouse Lab network in totality, it didn't have a specific or disproportionate impact on Wales because we had a share, a Barnet share, so a population equivalent share of the whole of the Lighthouse Lab laboratory network capacity.
Thank you. And can I ask you then, in terms of the Barnet share that was then allocated before Newport came online, was there ever any issue that you didn't have an ability to get the tests back because of capacity at any point after March of 2020, please? Well, so April 2020, when the Lighthouse laboratories were available.
So I think I've set out in the statement that during August and September there were capacity constraints within the Lighthouse laboratory network which affected Wales but also England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So there were particular instances in August and in September when the availability of tests at sampling sites were curtailed in order to prevent a backlog of samples building up within the laboratories.
Thank you. Can I ask you, please, again, just by reference to Newport, can we display your paragraph 173, please, which is at paragraph 14, sorry, page 49. That's paragraph 173 at page 49, please, of the statement 587349. Thank you. And if that could be expanded, I want to just check the position relating to the Newport laboratory. Obviously, you detailed there the ministerial advice and when it was expected for the laboratory to be operational. But it also indicates that after the 12 to 18 months period, it was intended it would be inherited by Wales to form part of Wales's national laboratory infrastructure for the future. And has that taken place for the Newport laboratory?
So the Lighthouse Lab in IP5 that was operated by PerkinElmer was it no longer exists, but the Public Health Wales laboratory that was established alongside it is still operational.
Thank you. And so just to help us understand, so PerkinElmer operated the Newport site, and why was there a public health laboratory alongside the PerkinElmer laboratory?
So initially, Public Health Wales, as you identified at the start, Public Health Wales had a network of laboratories in order to increase capacity, but in order to also increase the speed with which tests could be processed and results issued to the public, they presented us with a business case to enable them to consolidate their lab capacity at IP5 in Newport. That was in, I think, June or July of 2020. That business case was approved and they developed a larger laboratory at IP5. At the same time, that site was identified by UK Test and Trace as an ideal location for a Lighthouse laboratory. So from September, October 2020 through the two labs operated from the same facility.
Thank you. And so there's no ambiguity. So was it ever intended, as part of what we see in paragraph 173, that essentially the PerkinElmer side of the Lighthouse Lab would then become part of the infrastructure in Wales?
I think at the outset it had potentially been considered as an opportunity to benefit from that laboratory setup, but because it was commercially procured, once that contract ceased, the laboratory equipment and so on was disassembled.
Thank you. Can I then ask you, please, about, again, some of these, we appreciate that the fuller context is within the statement, but can I ask you then about the topic of the involvement of Roche and testing, please? You deal with it in your paragraph 131, please, which is page 38. And it's just to see if there's any additional assistance you can give us on the expectation that Wales was going to receive a capacity of tests from Roche, which then didn't transpire. So we can see you detail expectations on testing capacity, and this is in March 2020, included volumes that were dependent upon negotiations taking place between Public Health Wales and Roche Diagnostics. Public Health Wales led on the discussions with Roche. An agreement did not subsequently materialise with the Welsh Government, which the Welsh Government understands was attributed to a miscommunication of Wales's position by the UK Government, which was also in negotiation with Roche at the time. Roche subsequently entered an agreement with the United Kingdom Government to supply tests for all four nations, and Wales was allocated a share of these, around 900 per day at that time. This was significantly less than had been anticipated from the expected Public Health Wales deal. And so,
I think, can we just pause here? This is quite a controversial issue, as I recall, from my time in Cardiff. and I'm not sure the position is yet clear. So question, how much can you help, Ms Daniels? Because you're relying here on documents that others have produced.
That's correct, I am. And so I can reference to those documents, but I can't add beyond what's in them.
And I think one of the problems is that Roche don't necessarily agree with other people's positions. Is that right?
That may be the case, yes.
Well,
Question, can I get any further than I got in Cardiff?
Nope. I will move on then, my lady. Can we then, just on the topic of testing, on Amensa and the Amensa samples, please, can we display your paragraph 243, please, at page 69? And you detail as we move through this section on Amensa over the page, please, about, thank you, to highlight paragraph 245. Essentially, it's right, isn't it, that tests from Wales were then being processed at the Amensa laboratory, and then there was the issue as to the accuracy of those Amensa samples. And if we look at 245, you say I was very concerned about the impact of the incorrect reporting on Welsh residents, as Welsh tests had been diverted to the Amensa laboratory at that time due to high demand and to alleviate pressure on the Newport Lighthouse laboratory, where the majority of samples were processed. And you say in early October 2021, analysts in the Welsh Government had noticed that in some parts of Wales, the relationship between case rates and positivity rates was showing an unusual pattern, with positivity rates falling more rapidly than would be expected. Analysts tried to investigate by looking at cases by locality and age group, but did not have access to data by laboratory. There was also activity on social media of people reporting that they'd been positive on lateral flow devices, but their PCR test had been negative. Without the data from the laboratory, the initial focus centred on lateral flow device accuracy. And so pausing there. So is it fair to say that the laboratory itself didn't identify the issue to you? It was picked up by other routes in Wales relating to the Amensa tests?
That's correct. So if I may, and just go back a little, the Amensa lab had been contracted by UKHSA at an earlier point in time, so I think in February, March of 2021. And at that point, Public Health Wales had raised some concerns with UKHSA about the test results and seeming anomalies in the results emerging from that lab. Those concerns were raised at one of our Test Trace Protect programme board meetings. I made contact with UKHSA laboratory colleagues to set out that we were worried about the data emerging from this lab, and we were assured that everything was in order. The contract with the lab then ended, and a second contract was put in place that covered this September-October period, where again it seemed that there were anomalies in results emerging, and as the paragraph there states, primarily the concern was being raised by individuals receiving positive lateral flow tests and then negative PCR tests, and feeling that it just wasn't correct.
Thank you. And are you able to help? Was there any sort of issue then taken with the laboratory about why they'd not directly raised this issue from an audit point of view, and it needed essentially the other routes by where you identified the problem to flag that there was the issue?
Yeah, so I think the Amensa lab wasn't just utilised for tests coming from Wales. It was also the southwest of England, and public health colleagues in the southwest of England, I think, had noted similar discrepancies and discordance in results between lateral flow and PCR tests. That was raised again with UKHSA, at which point they investigated the lab and found that there were some significant and serious errors, and that a number of false negative results had been issued to members of the public.
Thank you. Can I asked to be displayed next, please, paragraph 140, which is at page 41, please. Thank you. And it's where you've helpfully detailed with another issue that the inquiry's heard some evidence about the Cardiff City Stadium Testing Centre. You say this on the 2nd of April 2020, it was announced that a United Kingdom government-operated drive-through test sampling site was opening at Cardiff City Stadium as part of the UK testing programme through arrangements with Deloitte. The opening of this test site had not been communicated before the announcement by the UK Government to Public Health Wales or the Welsh Government. As a result of this, rapid joint working with Public Health Wales and other key partners was required to get the site operational and set up for opening on the 7th of April. Can you expand at all about this? Because certainly we heard some evidence yesterday from Deloitte's perspective that they understood it was known, and certainly there have been arrangements that had to have been entered into with a local authority. And so can I ensure that we've got the totality of evidence as to what was known by the department, please?
Yeah. So I think important to put into context in this period that the national testing programme was very much at sort of an embryonic stage. Mechanisms for communication between Welsh Government and UK Government hadn't been formalised in terms of oversight of the national testing programme. So I think it's probably fair to say that communications were not optimal. I am aware that Deloitte were in contact with the local authority to discuss the establishment of the site, but we've not been able to identify any communications with Welsh Government at that time to suggest that we were aware that the site was going to be established.
Thank you. And in terms of that, as part of the collaboration that was taking place between you and the UK Government, and did that raise any concern, the fact that essentially plans were well afoot to establish a testing centre, in Cardiff, that the relevant organisations within Wales weren't aware of, particularly where health is a devolved matter?
So I think it's fair to say at the time, and this period was before I took up post, so I wasn't directly involved, but I was very aware that it caused some consternation across the department. But I think I'd reflect that this was a period of quite frenetic activity, and probably just reflects the speed with which people were trying to roll out and establish sampling sites and build testing capacity. So I would probably put this down to oversight rather than anything more than that.
Thank you. Can I now please explore with you the topic of asymptomatic testing and transmission, please? And please, can we go to your paragraph 167, page 47, please? And please bear with me, there's a number of documents I want to take you to explore with you that which you say in paragraph 167. You say this: on the 16th of May 2020, the Minister for Health and Social Services announced that all care home residents and staff were able to access tests on the UK Government portal under the National Testing Programme arrangements. And you provide a copy of that witness statement. And then over the page, please, it says, this announcement followed new advice from the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies on how testing should be deployed in care homes to help reduce transmission into and within care homes, including offering testing to all asymptomatic as well as symptomatic care home staff and residents in care homes that reported an incident or outbreak. And you go on. The new approach built on and expanded the existing approach in place. And then you attach the relevant advice. But can I then explore with you the fact that it's being headlined on the 16th of May as new by reference to a number of documents, please? Can we look first of all the 12th of May SAGE advice, please, which is INQ 217624. Thank you. And if we move into page 5 of that paper, please. Thank you. We can see that it references a strong scientific rationale to test all residents, irrespective of whether symptomatic or not, giving strong evidence of asymptomatic transmission in care homes. Now, the evidence for asymptomatic transmission underpinning this advice was in fact not new, and I think there's a large body of source material supporting the SAGE paper that existed from earlier months. And the position I want to ask you about is in what we've discussed already in terms of access to scientific advice. The Welsh Government decision makers had access to a lot of evidence of asymptomatic transmission prior to May of 2020. And perhaps if we can look at some examples of that, please. If we look at INQ 195520, please. This is Public Health Wales advice from 10th of February 2020. Thank you. And we can see just on page 1, it details this document summarises a pathway to be initiated following a first presumptive case of 2019 nCoV in Wales. It identifies the stages of initial assessment and diagnostic testing and to provide reassurance to Welsh Government. And if we move within this document, please, to page 4. Thank you. We can see on page 4 that it summarises the pathway to be initiated following a first presumptive case of COVID-19 in Wales, identifying the stages of initial assessment and diagnostic testing, information flow on receiving a positive result. And then if we move, through this paper to the appendix. Thank you. Again, I think the appendix also identifies the questions around does the call relate to a potential case, person with symptoms or asymptomatic contact with confirmed case? Are they an asymptomatic contact of a confirmed case? Now, again, this is February 2020, and I think also it's the Diamond Princess cruise ship had identified asymptomatic transmission at that point in February 2020. And so can I ask you just, if we pause there, because otherwise I'm going to give you a lot of dates before May. Was there an appreciation by the department and by the government of asymptomatic transmission in the February of 2020?
You're talking about a period before I was in post, so I can't necessarily address the specifics of what was known by individuals at that point in time. This document in itself, I don't think suggests that there was knowledge of asymptomatic transmission. It's reflecting that contacts of positive cases may not have symptoms because they may not be infected. I think it is fair to say that there was acknowledgement that asymptomatic transmission was possible, as was the case with a number of other respiratory viruses. However, in this, up until much later in the period, I don't think the extent of asymptomatic transmission nor the potential infectivity of an individual who was asymptomatic was well understood.
Thank you. And can we perhaps then just look at advice that was received by Mr. Gething, please? Thank you. That can be removed, which is INQ 136783. And I want to go into page 48 in that document, please. So this is the ministerial advice. And can we move to page 48, please? I think there may be a problem with the reference to paragraph I'm just going, so this is the advice from the 14th of May, but within that advice, and I apologise I can't display it to you at the moment, it identifies that asymptomatic positive individuals could be infectious prior to exhibiting symptoms. We've also got a statement that's been provided from Public Health Wales. Thank you. Sorry, can we just within that, sorry, just to go to then paragraph 173 within the statement of Mr. Gething, please. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, this is the context, I think. That advice was based on advice provided by the SAGE group. Thank you. Concerning the testing of asymptomatic care home staff and residents. Thank you. And so essentially there's a body of evidence, it suggested, that means it should have informed decision-making sooner. And I appreciate that it's already been addressed by the Welsh Government in their opening as to the position about whether that could have been addressed sooner. But have you anything further you can add that assists us about whether there should have been a change in the policy before May of 2020 that identified the need for asymptomatic testing, please?
So the advice from SAGE that you've displayed and referred to was the 12th of May. In that advice, SAGE gave a very clear recommendation that there should be asymptomatic testing in care homes of staff and residents. Subsequent to that, as you've displayed again, on the 14th of May, advice was given to ministers that we should introduce asymptomatic testing in care homes. That advice was approved and agreed by ministers and was then operationalised within 2 or 3 days of that decision being taken. So upon that SAGE evidence on the 12th, which I think was a significant turning point in terms of the understanding of the risks associated with asymptomatic individuals and their level of potential infectivity, the decision to introduce and implement routine and regular testing within care homes was taken.
Thank you. Can we then perhaps just look at the ministerial advice from March, please, which is INQ 235863. Thank you. If we move, please, to page 2 of this advice from March. This advice suggests that it was understood that around a third of cases are asymptomatic. And at paragraph 3, it details the Test Trace Protect Programme Board considered the testing of all asymptomatic as well as symptomatic close contacts, but recommended asymptomatic testing was not implemented due to concerns at the time over PCR testing capacity. There were also concerns about the possible behavioural effects, notably the risk that close contacts who test negative might break their self-isolation. And can I ask you then, was it a capacity issue rather than the current position of scientific advice that may have also factored into the decision to implement asymptomatic testing in the May?
The May decision on asymptomatic testing in relation to care homes was not constrained by capacity. That decision was driven by the advice of SAGE.
Thank you. Can we then please just clarify, because you are identifying in your statement about this being new, the advice of SAGE in the May, and I just want to question, do you stand by that referencing it as new evidence is appropriate in the full context of academic literature that was available in May of 2020 that did indicate there was good evidence of asymptomatic transmission?
So there were previous submissions to ministers. I think there was one on April the 30th that set out advice on testing in care homes that certainly did discuss and raise the issue of asymptomatic transmission. However, at that point, the best evidence that was available to us was that the asymptomatic transmission that was known and understood did not warrant universal testing in care homes. As I say, subsequently, SAGE was asked to provide advice, which it did on the 12th of May, and on the basis of that, further advice was given to ministers with a revised recommendation that asymptomatic testing of staff and residents be introduced.
Thank you.
Accepting that and accepting that obviously capacity is always a factor, but did people consider the possibility that there was asymptomatic transmission, and therefore the right approach, if one was going to contain this pandemic, was to operate on the basis there was asymptomatic transmission?
So the advice at the time also asked us to consider the potential risks of testing on an asymptomatic basis, in particular that you might get in periods of low prevalence a significant number of false positives that would lead to individuals being extracted from the workplace, which in and of itself could then create harms if you were not able to staff appropriately and safely. So whenever testing decisions were being made, there was always a balance of harms that was being considered. But as I say, in the case of care home testing and asymptomatic testing there, as soon as the evidence pointed conclusively to there being benefits from doing so, we did so.
What was the evidence to suggest the significant number of false positive tests?
There was evidence from Public Health Wales and from the Technical Advisory Cell. That was subsequently published then, I think in July, where they talked about the most effective use of PCR testing. And there are some tables in that document that set out the potential for false positives in low prevalence environments, and the need to consider whether that in and of itself would create more harm.
Thank you. Can I move on to a new topic, please? The contact tracing app. And perhaps if we orientate ourselves in your statement for this topic, please, page 96, paragraph 349. Thank you. We know essentially that the app, so Wales essentially tagged on to the England's development of their COVID-19 app. Is that correct?
We considered the possibility of developing a Wales-specific proximity app, but decided for a number of reasons, including the importance of interoperability with England, given the porous nature of the border between England and Wales, that an England and Wales app would be most appropriate.
Thank you. And if we move along to paragraph 353, we see just that you've told us about the interoperability group, discussions on ensuring the usability of that app. Obviously, the full details within the statement, but I wonder if you're able to help with a perspective on the take-up of the app once it was available. So we know the app was available from the 24th of September 2020, but we've had now some analysis presented as to the take-up of the app. And I know you've had access to it today, but can I just show you, please, INQ 574818. That's INQ 574818, and it's internal page 2, where there's a map that identifies. Thank you. If we move to page 2, and could we just expand the map, please? We'd expand it a little more. So I'm looking at B, and I know you've had a chance to look at it. We can see that the uptake in Wales was almost consistently throughout the whole of Wales, low at the sort of 15 to 20% rate. And are you able to, well, first of all, had you ever been provided with this data, first of all, as to uptake across Wales?
So we did have access to the uptake data. I've never seen it presented in this format before, though.
Thank you. And are you able, and I don't want to, if it's speculation, please don't, but are you able to help us understand why there was such a low uptake of the app in Wales?
So I'm not aware of any specific analysis that's been undertaken to explain the differences in uptake, but some reflections that I would offer. Comparisons between England and Wales, it's quite important to use parts of England that are more similar to Wales in terms of their socio-economic makeup. So that may be something that we would typically look at the northwest of England, for example, rather than the generality of England. I think digital exclusion, it's referenced actually in the Public Health Wales response plan that ONS estimates suggest that about 20% of the Welsh population are what they would term digitally excluded. So again, that may have had an impact on uptake. I think it's also fair to say that we saw the app as being an adjunct to contact tracing. We tended not to refer to it as a contact tracing app. We tended to refer to it as a proximity app, which may sound pedantic, but actually reflected, I think, that we thought it was a useful way of telling people that they may have been in proximity rather than as a instruction, as it were, to isolate in the way that contact tracing was. As a consequence, I think it's also fair to say that we didn't promote uptake specifically in Wales beyond the promotional efforts that were made by UK government.
Thank you. Just three further short questions from me, please. Thank you. That can be taken down. Financial support for isolation. We displayed earlier in evidence with another witness the financial support that became available in Wales, initially at the 500 rate and then increased to the 750 rate from the August of 2021. But can I ask you more broadly, you talk about financial support for isolation. Are you able to assist us to or respond to criticism of the financial support payments, which there's a general view that they were not enough, especially for individuals from vulnerable communities due to precarious work status, refugee status or otherwise?
So I think we were aware that there were a number of barriers to isolating when people had been asked to do so. Those concerns about the impact of isolation also probably we were concerned were reducing take-up of testing as well. So we had set in place right from the outset the strand of work known as Protect to try and support and facilitate people to adhere to isolation. I think we were clear that the barriers to isolation were largely structural rather than motivational. So by structural, I'm referring to those socioeconomic challenges that people faced. So we had been advocating for financial support and ministers had been advocating for financial support in their discussions with UK government for some time. But the October-November was the first point at which we were able to introduce that because we were able to benefit from financial consequentials from the UK government following the introduction of financial support there.
Thank you. And are you able to give any additional assistance? Wales was unique in increasing the availability up to £750. Did that take much decision-making to increase it for the period from the August of 2021 to the January 2022?
So that decision was very closely bound into the decision at that point to remove the requirement to isolate for contacts who were vaccinated or who were under 18. And I think it was well understood that the unvaccinated population at that point in time tended to be those from lower socioeconomic groups, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic groups, etc. and that they would therefore be disproportionately affected by the continuing need to isolate if they weren't vaccinated. And so the decision was made to provide additional financial support, so the increase of £250.
Thank you. And can I ask you, in respect of the self-isolation support scheme, was there an equality impact assessment for that?
So in the advice that was given to ministers in October 2020, there is reference to an equality impact assessment being undertaken, and a summary of the headline conclusions of that equality impact assessment were set out for ministers to consider.
Thank you. And then finally, for my purposes, because my time's nearly up, recommendations. Again, there's a number of paragraphs that deal with lessons learning and recommendation on behalf of the department. But can I ask you just briefly about paragraph 630, please, at page 167. That can be displayed. It's paragraph 600. Thank you. You say at paragraph 630 that planning for future preparedness needs to consider the standing capability and scaling up of test, trace and isolate required across the 5 routes of transmission. Are you able to assist about what the present state of the standing capability and scaling up is in Wales currently, please?
So having left the post in March 2022, I can't speak personally to the current state of preparedness, but a review of public health arrangements was undertaken, and those recommendations are in the process of being implemented. And as I understand it, in part that relates to having standing capacity for contact tracing.
Thank you, Milady. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Daniels.
Mr Thomas, who's over there. That way.
Thank you.
Sorry. Good afternoon. Let me just give you a little bit of an introduction. My name's Leslie Thomas and I'm representing FEMHO, that's the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. I only have a couple of questions for you. But in your witness statement, you say this, and just forgive me, I just need to quote just a little bit of it to you. You say, in October 2020, the Welsh Government funded the appointment of dedicated black and minority ethnic public health outreach workers in each health board. The community outreach workers were focused on providing support, breaking down barriers, preventing ethnic minority groups from taking COVID-19 tests, supporting people to self-isolate when necessary, encouraging vaccine uptake and facilitating a two-way communication between organisations and communities. The outreach workers, in each health board, also supported engagement work for refugees, asylum seekers and migrant groups. This aimed to maximise outreach for test, trace, protect and widen engagement on all matters related to prevention of further COVID-19 related deaths. This was based on learning from international models for mobilising community outreach like the barefoot workers in India. And you say a suite of 28 different languages in different accessible formats were developed to communicate, test, trace and protect black and Asian and minority ethnic people and vulnerable groups in Wales. My question's this: how successful do you consider that the outreach plan was, given all of that you were doing?
So we didn't undertake a formal evaluation of those of the work that those individuals undertook, but we did have feedback at our regular TTP oversight group meetings, where health board colleagues, local authority colleagues would talk to us about activities that were being undertaken locally and regionally, and we were able also to gather case studies of good practice, effective practice across testing and contact tracing.
Given all that you were doing, were you ever consulted by the other UK governments about the potential utility of your outreach plan?
That's an interesting question. No, I don't think we were. I think in my statement I've reflected that some of the UK arrangements for discussion on tracing or the protect element weren't as formalised as they were for testing because of the national testing programme. But we did meet with colleagues fairly regularly on an informal basis to exchange experiences, evidence, emerging practice. It's possible that during those meetings this was discussed, but I personally wasn't involved in any.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you,
Milady.
Mr Thomas. Ms Munro, who's just there.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mrs Daniels. My name is Alison Munro. I represent COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK. Just two questions. They arise out of your discussion in your statement on equality assessments, where you set out that there were equality impact assessments, and these were continually reviewed as test, trace and protect developed and evolved in respect of certain groups in the population with protected characteristics under the Equality Act. However, why were there delays in getting national testing programme advice and support materials to certain groups, to certain vulnerable groups in the population?
I'm not aware that there were particular delays in information being made available to those vulnerable groups. The materials that we produced to provide the communication materials that we produced for Test, Trace, Protect were always translated into multiple languages, and we had a number of forums and groups that we were engaged with that we used to disseminate information. So the Race Equality Forum, Disability Forums, just as two examples.
But in that paragraph where you're discussing equality impact assessment, you say, I recognise there were at times delays in providing materials to advise and support for some groups. You don't name which groups they are, but you acknowledge that there were delays. So why were those delays?
There may have been delays because of requirements for translation, for example, but I'm not aware of significant delays beyond those operational impacts that there might have been.
And are you able to be more specific in terms of which particular groups you had in mind when you say particular or certain vulnerable groups?
No, I'm afraid I can't expand on the statement.
The second question is this. Bearing in mind your answer just now and what you've said in your statement, what should and could have been done to ensure that all groups that were described as vulnerable and those with protected characteristics received information when in a timely fashion, so there wasn't any, whoever it was for and whatever the delay was, there shouldn't have been any, and what should have been done to alleviate that?
So the feedback that we had from our communications was that we achieved quite significant reach with our communications. We were, I think, very fortunate to be able to use our local authority colleagues to disseminate information beyond the sort of traditional channels that that government would be able to use. I think I would reflect on the importance of doing that sometimes national campaigns, while they are often very, very effective, actually utilising local communication channels could be of more significant value in being able to reach out to groups that perhaps sometimes are lesser heard.
Thank you very much, Mrs Daniels. That's not the first time we've heard about the importance of local groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Munro. That completes our questions for you, Ms Daniels. Thank you very much indeed for the help that you've given. Having left, was it your former colleagues who prepared the very full witness statement?
Myself and my former colleagues.
Well, thank you to all of you for the help. Obviously, it was quite some achievement to prepare such a detailed statement. So I promise you we will be taking into account the written evidence as well as the oral evidence.
Thank you very
for your
much.
help. I shall return at 1:45.
Thank you, my lady.
All rise.